Hi CES, this is Mrs. Hanson. I'm going to read you Mr. McCloskey's Marvelous Mallards, The Making of Make Way for Ducklings by Emma Bland Smith. I hope you enjoy the story. Robert McCloskey stood back and studied his sketches. He shook his head. These ducks are not right, he thought. That wasn't how a duck waddled, or fell on her behind, or flapped his wings. He paced around his New York City studio. How did he get himself into this duck-drawing mess anyway? It had all started 4 years before, when he was in art school in Boston. Walking to and from classes, he'd laugh at the funny mallard ducks in the park. He fed them peanuts and watched as they splashed and dove in the lake. Once he ran into a whole family on the sidewalk, waddling into the public garden in a long, orderly row. Mr. McCloskey finished art school and ended up in New York City. A few years later, he returned to Boston for a visit. He'd completed his first children's book and was wondering what to write about next. Again, he saw those funny mallards. He remembered the family of ducks he'd seen on the sidewalk. He smiled, his eyes sparkled, and there it was, his story. A pair of mallard ducks looking for a safe place to raise their ducklings in a busy city. Bingo! It had taken him quite a while to get the words on paper. Then, when he finally had a rough story, it was time to draw the illustrations to go with the words. And that's how he found himself today, scratching his head, searching his memory, picturing those ducks, trying his darndest to draw them. It was, let's just say, harder than he'd expected. He brought the sketches to his editor. She was not impressed. He didn't blame her. I can do better, he thought. I have to do better. I need to see actual ducks, he decided, and went uptown to the Science Museum. For days, Mr. McCloskey studied the stuffed ducks at the museum. He looked at them from the right and from the left. He gathered more scientific information about ducks than he knew what to do with. He sketched and erased and started from scratch. But when he stood back and looked at the sketches, he frowned. These ducks were just okay. And just okay wasn't good enough. His editor would never accept these drawings. I can do better, he thought. I have to do better. What else would help? Live models, that was it. He came home with a box full of tiny ducklings, very alive and very loud. For the next few months, the ducklings lived in Mr. McCloskey's studio. It wasn't easy using them as models. They did not cooperate. They wouldn't stay still, and they clumped together instead of walking in a row. What's more, they made a terrible mess, and they woke everyone at dawn with their infernal quacking. Mr. McCloskey's roommate was not amused. Mr. McCloskey was determined. He crawled around studying the ducklings. He sketched them waddling and running, plopping down and jumping up. He crawled around after them so much his knees just about gave out on him. His sketches were getting there, but they still weren't good enough. Not for his editor and not for him. Even the ducks didn't seem to think much of them. I can do better, he thought. I have to do better. He was willing to do whatever it took to make these drawings perfect. So he thought a bit, and then he did what any reasonable person would do. He went out and bought more ducks, grown ones this time. He focused his mind. It was time to tackle the hardest illustrations of all, flying. How on earth was he going to draw an airborne mallard? The weeks passed by. Mr. McCloskey drew and drew and drew. He worked on the writing too, cutting words and letting the drawings tell the action. He was almost there. And time was almost up because the ducks had simply become impossible. They hogged the bathtub, splashed something awful, and caused leaks in the ceiling underneath. It wasn't really their fault. Being cooped up in a studio was no life for a duck. They needed to go. So Mr. McCloskey drove the ducks out to a friend's place in the country. There they could make all the mess they wanted and quack as early as they liked. It was just the right place for a flock of noisy ducks. He said goodbye, and they quacked back at him. In his studio again, he went over the manuscript, holding his breath. He turned the last page and grinned. The drawings were better than just okay. They were better than getting there. They were absolutely top-notch. The work hadn't been easy. It hadn't always been fun either, but it was the greatest thing he'd ever done. He felt sure the ducks would have approved too. And although he was normally a calm sort of fellow, Mr. McCloskey grabbed his drawings and practically flew uptown to show them to his editor. And this time, she was extremely impressed. But what about children? They were the toughest judges of all, and the ones who really mattered. When the book came out, Make Way for Ducklings was a hit. All it took was 6 years, buckets of patience, a good supply of erasers, and a studio full of spirited ducks. The end.